Here's the second part of the Rodgers and Hammerstein talk, and this starts with South Pacific. An author named James L. Michener, very prolific author, one of those guys I think had a crank on the side of his typewriter. He wrote a whole bunch of short stories in addition to novels, some of which dealt with World War II, one of which was a collection of stories called Tales of the South Pacific. Rodgers and Hammerstein and the director Joshua Logan felt that this might be a pretty good source for a musical. And Rodgers also said, well, the military theme, I really want to try to market. I know the sexism this is going to sound like, but he felt he wanted to market to a male audience. He felt that they weren't reaching out to the men of households. And if they had a show that had a more military base to it, it might be more interesting to people. In addition to that, though, South Pacific was Oscar Hammerstein's opportunity for another of many moments in his life to comment on racism. And in the case of South Pacific, you might not see it there at first, but when you think about it, it's very, very much a part of the plot. South Pacific has an interesting inversion. Again, we use the soubrette and the ingenue kind of structure, except in this case, they're sort of reversed, because I think that the soubrette characters, Nellie Forbush and Emile Debec, are kind of, well, they're bigger parts, and they kind of carry the main story. The subplot in this case is a little bit more ingenue-like between a Lieutenant Cable and a young lady named Liat. South Pacific takes place, surprise, in the South Pacific during the Second World War, during that sort of shuffling of real estate between the Allies and the Axis back and forth. And a large number of naval soldiers are occupying a small island and trying to move from atoll to atoll and take over the next island for the United States. Nellie, kind of the main character of the story, she's a nurse, and she's sort of the little sister around the troop. They kind of treat her as a kid sister, they kind of all protect her. Nobody dates her really, but they kind of think of her as one of their own. And Nellie eventually develops a relationship with someone who lives on the other side of the island, a man named Emile Debec. Interesting things about Emile Debec: he's an expat, he's an expatriate from a foreign country. He's not part of the United States Navy. He's significantly older than Nellie. He's well-to-do, and he seems to keep to himself. And all of these things lead Nellie to think that he's kind of mysterious, kind of interesting. So she winds up becoming closer and closer to him. At the meantime, we have the ingenue plot between Cable and Liat. A Tonkinese woman named Bloody Mary comes to the base a lot to sell cigarettes and trinkets and things. What she's really doing is she's trying to scout out just the right man to introduce to her daughter, who is a sheltered young Polynesian woman who does not speak any English at all. Cable meets her and finds her quite beautiful and communicates with her and is very gentle and very respectful. And it's a very pure kind of love that they develop. However, Cable gets a real hard time from his fellow soldiers. They kind of attack him for having gone native, and they kind of make fun of him for having a relationship with someone who is Asian and who is not of the same race. Liat and Cable's kiss is really the first interracial kiss live on stage on Broadway. And Cable sings a song called You've Got to Be Carefully Taught, where he sort of goes off on those guys and tells them that racism is something you aren't born with, that you develop as part of a behavior that you're taught. In the meantime, Emile reveals to Nellie, quite by accident, after they've been dating for some time, that he has children, 2 of them, from a previous relationship, who are also Asian. This upsets Nellie for a lot of reasons. I guess if you date somebody and you go out with them for a while, the fact that they have kids should come up earlier. She's kind of scandalized. She also has her own inner racism to try to tangle with, because she wonders if she can handle this person who has these Asian children. It is determined that the next island over may or may not be occupied by the enemy, and the Navy decides they should put a small number of people out into a boat to go check it out as an advanced sort of recon mission. Cable volunteers for this, and Emile, perhaps despondent because he wants to try to win Nellie back, even though he has no dog in this race, says, I know the island and the shore really well, I'll go with you. The boat is attacked and blown up, and only one of these characters survives. In fact, it's Emile. And Nellie has a moment to sort of rush out to say, I was so silly, I was so hung up on this other issue, and it could have been the last thing we ever talked about, and I'm so glad that you survived. It's sad that Leon and Cable's relationship is doomed because they do not wind up together. Obviously, Cable is killed. And the piece ends on this sort of bittersweet note because we have one couple reunited and one that is torn apart. South Pacific is, again, a dramatic piece. It really carries its message remarkably well. It features some beautiful music, including a song called Some Enchanted Evening, which became a successful independent single, in addition to being a successful album, another cast album for Rodgers and Hammerstein. Another note about South Pacific. Rodgers and Hammerstein figured out with this show that they could flood the world with South Pacific dolls, lunchboxes, shirts, every product you can imagine, hats, book and record sets, toys. And this becomes the first show that has a significant marketing push with related merchandise. And the merchandising for South Pacific would make them a whole lot of money. If you decide to see the film version of South Pacific, you may be a little disoriented. There's something very odd and peculiar about it. The budget was such that originally they thought it might have been filmed in black and white, but another person felt that black and white films were really passé and were not going anywhere. And so the decision was made to try to colorize the film using colored lenses over the camera. So rather than simply color film, if a scene was at night, they would just put a big blue lens over the camera. If the scene had somebody who was angry for a minute, maybe we'll go to a red lens. If the scene, as a result, the people in the movie are blue and red and green, and it's really kind of weird. It's because of the process that was used, it's tough to find a good copy and have it retouched either. Another fact, by the way, both Oklahoma and South Pacific, not to mention almost all of the Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals, were made into films. In many cases, in keeping with the Hollywood production code, some of the heavier stuff that we talk about in these gets a little bit whitewashed and washed over. For example, Judd's character is diminished in the film of Oklahoma, and his songs are cut, and he's not quite the character that he is in the play. I think this might be a reason why a lot of people associate Oklahoma and Rodgers and Hammerstein in general with these sort of square, old-fashioned, G-rated, goody-good kind of materials. And people say, oh, well, Rodgers and Hammerstein, it's so old-fashioned, so square. They're probably relating to the film and probably sort of reacting to that. I want to move on. I'm going to talk to you, again, with Rodgers and Hammerstein, the shows are so significant that you wind up covering a lot of plot and a lot of production. As you know, this doesn't always happen with all of the artists that we talk about. We don't always go show by show, but this is a career that's just filled with any one of these shows would be worthy of a lecture of its own. The King and I in 1951 is such a show. I think if somebody asked me, you know, I don't know if I have a favorite musical, but I might have a favorite musical score. I kind of think the music to The King and I is some of the most sophisticated and gorgeous music Rodgers and Hammerstein ever wrote and has ever been written for the theater. It was not an easy adaptation to make. Once upon a time, there was an actress named Gertrude Lawrence. And Gertrude Lawrence had felt that The King and I film that she had recently acted in, a non-musical, would make a great musical. This is the first time this happens. This happens all the time now. Gertrude Lawrence said to Richard Rodgers, I'm starring in a movie right now, and it's about Anna and the King of Siam. And I think you should write music and put it on the stage. This was a stage adaptation of a film. The film was based upon a novel. The stage adaptation version also went back to film, as you know, and became a hit as the movie musical. And then the movie musical was adapted and brought back to the stage, and this goes round and round. Gertrude Lawrence felt very much that this could make an interesting musical. It's set in what was then referred to as Siam, part of Southeast Asia. And it covers the notion that the King of Siam has sent for a woman to teach English to his sons initially, although Anna, the English teacher, would eventually persuade him that all of the children should be taught. And she comes into this very foreign, very unusual land with her son. It's also interesting that this is a piece where you have kind of hints of romance, but this is not a romance in the sense that the characters wind up together, get married, live happily ever after. They don't even kiss. They don't have that. They have a relationship of sort of mutual respect at times, and they kind of challenge each other a lot. And sometimes they have this sort of distant, well, what would happen if we did do this? They dance and such. But it's purposely a little bit more nuanced and together a relationship. The relationship between Anna and the king, one would consider to be perhaps the ingenue relationship in this piece, but yet the soubrette relationship in The King and I is extremely dark. It features a character named Lun Ta and a young woman named Tup Tim. Tup Tim is a slave. She's owned by the king of Siam. Lun Ta is an ambassador from Burma, and he is in love with her. And together, they decide they should run off, and they're caught. Lun Ta he's beheaded, and the king is faced with the decision of what the law is supposed to be, which is to publicly whip the young lady, Tup Tim. When he goes to do this, Anna gets between him and his whip and this young girl and kind of challenges him and says, what sort of a person are you? And he slowly brings his arm down and changes his mind. And in doing so, some people see a real gap in authority, and they begin to see weakness in the king. The king ultimately dies in this piece. He's not killed, he becomes ill and he dies. But it's still a real compromise to his authority. It becomes a political crisis that if he's seen as weak, or if he's seen as treating women even close to equally, it could hurt the country as a whole. That's how they view it. An interesting technique was used in this piece in writing the music for it. Two things that I think you'll find fascinating. One, Richard Rodgers said, I don't want to hear any of the music of the Far East when I write this music. I just want to write music, and occasionally when it's time for some of the more foreign sounding music, I want to write what a foreign country's music would sound like to me in my imagination. And ironically, in doing so, he was actually commended by some people who said what a nice job he did in recreating some of the music of Southeast Asia. Secondly, in order to create the idea that English is someone's second language, various characters in The King and I, in the early parts, their voices are represented by individual musical instruments. Rodgers said, you know, I know sometimes if you didn't speak English, you might know somebody was angry, but you wouldn't quite know what they were angry about. And as the characters bridge the gap, as the play goes on, and as they come to understand each other's language a little bit better, we get less of the instrumental cover of someone, wah, 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 and more words, until finally we're doing all words back and forth by the end of the play. It means that a little bit of it, sometimes you might not catch a few words or a few phrases of the other person's language, so they would go from spoken, a little bit of instrumental, spoken, just to kind of cover it up like that. It's a really effective way of expressing this. The King and I has been successfully revived. In fact, The King and I's most recent revival, appearing on Broadway now, was just honored with a series of Tony Awards. And I think as one of the links with our module, I'll probably show you a little bit of a performance from the Tony Awards of that production. It's really quite well put together. The choreographer on this one was a man named Jerome Robbins, and he would go on to have a very successful career as a choreographer, not only for Rodgers and Hammerstein, but for a wide variety of other composers throughout the years. Well, I'm not going to go every single show through step by step like this, but I do want to tell you a little bit about Flower Drum Song in 1958. Well, interestingly enough, we've had shows now like Porgy and Bess, which had an all-African-American cast. The Flower Drum Song is our first production with an all-Asian cast. It is set in the Chinatown of San Francisco in the 1950s. It's kind of a silly plot, really, in some respects, about a mail-order bride being sent to the wrong address, and rather than being sent back, kind of being romancing this other character. It also has to do quite a bit, however, more than anything, with generational differences between very strict, very traditional, foreign immigrant parents and first-generation American kids that argue that they want to be able to date and stay out as late as they want and dress how they like. Probably the most famous song from this show, I think, has one of the most ironic context versus non-context situations. It's a song in this show called I Enjoy Being a Girl. When it was written, the character, played by an actress who won a Tony for it, named Pat Suzuki, is a young daughter telling her mother, I enjoy staying out late, I enjoy wearing my hair up, I enjoy doing all of these things, and I should be allowed to do them, and it's a sign of rebellion. The song, out of context, if you've heard it at all, kind of now only exists as a novelty song for kind of an ironic other purpose. It sounds incredibly sexist. It sounds incredibly dismissive of the stereotype of the girl who stays on the phone all day and puts makeup all over her face and those sort of things. But in the case of the character, she's really actually saying, I want to be able to do things that other people do in this world. The last Rodgers and Hammerstein show together was The Sound of Music in 1960. And the film, of course, came out 5 years later. I am going to try to tell you a couple things you don't already know about The Sound of Music. You probably know that it's based on a true story about the Von Trapp family singers who fled the Anschluss, the German annexation of Austria during the Second World War. That Maria, their governess, starts out as a novice in a convent and winds up married to the captain, the father of these children. What you might not know is that The Sound of Music was originally conceived as what Rodgers called, quote, a play with music, as opposed to a musical. They wanted all of the songs in The Sound of Music to come out of occasions where, even if it was just a straight up real life moment, they would sing. Remember way back in the first lecture I talked about conventions, about how characters in musical just burst out in song. That it just happens, and we accept that as something that's not part of real life. The original idea for Sound of Music was all the music could be the nuns' vespers, the performances that the Von Trapp children sing, perhaps someone whistling while they do their housework up and down the hall, a character humming to himself, a character singing a song to kind of impress another character. And the idea was originally all of the songs would grow directly out of the action and not have any particular songs that just kind of are songs. Eventually the producers kind of leaned on Rodgers and Hammerstein and changed that, and a few songs did come through that are straight up musical theater stuff, such as 16 Going on 17, How Do You Solve a Problem Like Maria. These are songs, these are dialogue, plot that is sung, but it's not. But originally the idea was that. During rehearsals for The Sound of Music, Oscar Hammerstein became suddenly ill. It turned out when he went to the hospital for what he thought was indigestion, it was stomach cancer, and he died. He did not live to see The Sound of Music successful on stage or in film. For Richard Rodgers this time around, interestingly, he kind of decided he wanted to keep writing. Although he never achieved the kind of success he had with Hammerstein, he kind of kicked around with a couple of other lyricists. Interesting stuff. For example, he worked with Sheldon Harnick, the man who did lyrics for Fiddler on the Roof on a show called Rex. He worked with Martin Charnin, who wrote Annie on a show called 2 by 2. In 1965, you can hear in a show called Do I Hear a Waltz, the really bizarre combination of Rodgers and Sondheim. Stephen Sondheim had a very special relationship with Rodgers and Hammerstein. I'll talk about that later. He also worked as his own lyricist in a piece called No Strings. None of these really worked out so well. You might also be interested in noting that his daughter, Mary Rodgers, a successful composer in her own right, and she wrote a very successful little show called Once Upon a Mattress. Rodgers died in 1979, a little bit after the opening of a revival of Oklahoma, and is viewed as this catalog, this 50-year epic catalog of songs that he had contributed to people that are still sung and performed today. Richard Rodgers and Mary Rodgers together were key in putting together something called the Rodgers and Hammerstein Library. Not only does it keep all of the papers of Rodgers and Hammerstein and Larry Hart and some others, it also is among the offices that serves as a bureau for renting the rights to existing musicals. Richard Rodgers was very good at the idea of let's market our shows after they close as shows that community theaters and schools and groups can do in amateur productions, and we can collect a royalty fee for that. That library holds all of these shows. It also struck a deal in the 1980s with Andrew Lloyd Webber, so they also market all of his shows, and several other pieces over the years that they've also acquired. And it's probably because there was a real influx in between the 1960s and the 1980s where these shows became very available. It meant that a lot of high schools and a lot of colleges and a lot of church groups and community theaters, a lot of people did these shows. And this may be one of the reasons that people feel like these are the shows that they really associate with musicals and that they feel they've seen 1,000 times. But they still have life, and they still revive, as The King and I would be a good example, very successfully over the years. And I still highly recommend this stuff. It's really some of the best work in the American theater. So that's the Rodgers and Hammerstein lecture. There'll be some attached modules and some other stuff with this one, or rather some attached links, etc. I hope you enjoy those, and we'll see you next time.